Hello and welcome to the GT Woodshop, and indeed to part 2 of building cabinets for my wonderful collection of bourbons and rye whiskey. I know, how wonderful, but a little diversity is good for the soul. Well, that's what I preach anyway. So in this video I'm going to continue with the cabinet build, and as mentioned in the last, links by the way will be up above and down below. As mentioned in the previous video, I'm going to start by creating a reference edge with my rail saw, then a 90-degree cut so I've got my foundation to work from, and then it'll be off to the router table to set depth of cut. Let's get to it. So my first reference edge is potentially, arguably, the most important cut of the build, because from it every other cut will follow. So I mentioned in part 1 that I'm not going to be using the table saw or indeed the planer to create my first reference edge, and I'm going to use my Festool TS55 rail saw so that I can ensure I get that cut exactly where I want it. And then after that I'll use the MFT again to cut the 90-degree cut, which will end up being either the base or top of each panel. That's all my first reference cuts made. So next I'm going to cut the right angles. To do that, I'm going to use 4 bench dogs, 2 low height dogs for the board to sit up against, and then 2 taller dogs for my rail to sit up against, and I've got my right angle. I will not be using this contraption that Festool designed that flips down. I really have a poor opinion of it, but I'll save that for a MFT3 review video. So let's get these cuts made and we can move on to the router table. And finally to the router table. Certainly feels like it's taken a while to get here on this project, but then never mind, it'll all be worth it in the end and my bourbon will thank me. So I need to set the height of the router bit. My chosen template, MDovJ, says approximate depth of cut is 15 mil. Now I've got my handy little guide set to 15 mil. Now I know I've said it before on previous videos, but I'm going to say it again. It really is worthwhile being absolutely pernickety and fussy as fussy can be when, when setting the height of the bit and the center of the bit. If you're a nidgy bit out, it will throw the rest of the project. So I'm happy with that. That's just grazing the top. So I'm going to lock that down, get a couple of pieces of scrap and see what it's like for size. So in order to make the depth of height cut, it's necessary to line up your fence with the middle of your router bit, the center of your router bit. Now the manual says the approximate center. I believe the manual should say the exact center. Couple of points I just want to tell you about if you're going to be doing this yourself. Just before you clamp your material to the right angled fixture, lock it off with the middle nut and clamp it so that it can't tip. Because I've done it in the past where you clamp your timber to the right angled fixture and you're so focused on keeping it in place that you end up tipping the right angled fixture, and then of course when you push it back flat the work pieces are off the router table and it all goes to pot. The other point I want to mention is to make sure that your timber is flat to the bench, touching the fence but flat to the router top. That's the most important bit. Well, I'm chuffed with that. I don't always get it right first time. There is a slight amount of movement in the joints, but I think that'll be great for the glue up. If I nudge it any tighter than that, I think it's just going to push all of the glue out when I do the assembly. So that's good for me. You remember at the beginning of the video I said I can't size the panels until I've set depth of cut. So what I'm going to do now is just do part of the B cuts. I think there'll be, just to see what's left at the top, and then I can size my panels. I've got 3mm left that I need to take into account to get my height correct. Okay, so I'm ready to size my panels. And now's also a good point to tell you about my concerns. With an 850mm tool, 19mm thick, I left my panels come out to, and 340mm wide, that constitutes a rather big, potentially clumsy panel to attach to a much shorter right angle fixture that's held on to the Incra fence by 2 nylon screws. So I'm concerned that the panel is going to be too big and that it could tip and become unsteady. So it's my intention to make a mock cabinet out of these 2 pieces of MDF that I've cut. So I'm going to size all of my panels now to height and to width. 340mm wide to line it up perfectly with my chosen template MDovJ. So I've got all my panels cut to size, length and width, all identical due to the shop stop that comes with the Incra fence and mitre gauge. A really worthwhile investment, highly recommend it. So my next setup job is to set center cut. Now in the past, I've got to own up and admit to the fact that I've not spent quite enough time on the center cut, and that it's been a hair off, and I've had to shoot the difference off with a hand plane. I intend for that not to happen this time, so I'm going to make it my best work. Well, after a few fine adjustments, I have centre of board set and I'm ready to go. So, here are 2 MDF panels cut to the same size as my cabinet panels. That's a lot of weight to push across the rotor bit, which is why I've cut 2 MDF panels. So I'm going to make all of the cuts for the tailboards on these test MDF panels, just to make sure it will perform, because I think I'm pushing it to the limit. But there's only one way to find out. Well, I'm glad I decided to do a full joint test. Even with the extra time and effort I put into getting center cut correct, I was still out. So this is the second iteration. 2 clicks on the fine adjuster on the sliding rail was all it was out, but those 2 clicks, by the time it's compounded by the way the system works, flipping the pieces around, it was a real noticeable edge. But now it's beautiful. So I'm ready. The boards, or the system, coat admirably with the 850mm boards. So I've no other excuses left. It's time for me to cut the side panels. So for those following along at home, or planning to follow along at home, I thought we'd have a little recap just before we perform the final deed. I've thicknessed all of my panels to exactly the same height. I've cut all of the panels to exactly the same width. I've cut all of the sides to exactly the same height, and the top and bottoms to exactly the same length. So I've continuity across all of the pieces that I'm about to put through the router table. I've set the height of cut as per my template. I've set a center cut several times, and I've finally got it right through a process of trial and error. But I'd rather make those errors now on my test MDF than I would do on my final oak pieces. So I've centered all of my scales and templates. I've got one scale set so that the very widest point of my router bit is at 0, and then I can cut my 8mm rebate on the back of all my side panels, which are my tail cuts. And of course I've got my MDovJ template set with the whole thing at the recommended center point for my template. High-rise fence installed to support the pieces as they're so long whilst I'm doing the rebate cut, but as soon as that's set, this will have to come off because it will foul my clamp on the right-angled fixture. I think that's everything covered. To be honest, I am a little apprehensive, even though the test went fine. But as mentioned earlier, I have no other excuses to rely on. I just need to do the dirty deed, as the saying goes. Here we go. Well, that was the neck end of 2 hours at the router table. My back's killing me, but that's one hell of a lot of dovetails. So let's see how well they fit together. Feels okay. Good so far. Well, I'm absolutely delighted with the way the joints have come out. They are beautiful. Dare I use the word perfect? I see no gaps. Nice and tight, right depth. Alignment is the best I've ever achieved. I think I might deserve a glass or 3 of bourbon. And I also think that this video is now long enough. So I'll draw it to a close. In the next video, I'm going to deal with the inclusions, the knots and splits and gaps with a spot of bourbon coloured resin. Then I'm going to cut the slot for the back panel. And finally, I'll be using Festool's LR32 system to cut the holes for the shelf pegs and for the hinges. I hope you'll join me in part 3 or 4, whichever one it is. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Ta-ra. Where's my bourbon?